The bright studio lights illuminated the stage as the cameras rolled, capturing the moment that would soon ignite a nationwide conversation. The host, a seasoned journalist known for her tough interviews, sat poised, ready to challenge her guest in a way that would test both his patience and resilience. Across from her sat Nathaniel Kane, a man whose name had become synonymous with success, innovation, and defying expectations. As the CEO of one of the most influential tech companies in the world, he had shattered barriers in an industry historically dominated by others. But today, it wasn't his achievements or groundbreaking work in artificial intelligence that were under scrutiny. It was his very presence. The opening question was framed as a compliment, but carried an undeniable weight. "Your success is remarkable," the host began, her tone smooth yet calculated. "But some might say that in today's world, certain opportunities are being handed out based on factors beyond merit. Do you think your position is a reflection of true achievement, or do you believe initiatives aimed at diversity have played a role in your rise?" The implication was clear. It wasn't curiosity. It was doubt, a challenge wrapped in polite professionalism. Nathaniel didn't flinch. He had encountered this line of questioning before, though never so publicly, never so thinly veiled. He let the silence linger just long enough for the weight of the question to settle in before responding. His voice was calm, deliberate. "It's fascinating how that question always seems to surface when someone who looks like me succeeds," he said, his words cutting through the air like a razor. "Nobody ever asks if the countless CEOs before me, who all came from the same backgrounds, were given opportunities based on something other than merit. But the moment the equation changes, suddenly, we need to investigate." The audience shifted. Some leaned in, captivated by his measured yet undeniable assertion of truth. The host, momentarily caught off guard, attempted to regain control. But Nathaniel wasn't there to seek approval or play a game of justifications. He was there to stand firm in the truth, that his presence, his success, and his worth were not up for debate. The air in the studio had shifted. What had started as a routine morning interview was now something far more electrifying. The audience, once passive observers, were now active witnesses to a moment of reckoning. The host, seasoned and sharp, attempted to mask her discomfort with a tight-lipped smile, but it was clear that Nathaniel Kane's response had struck a nerve. She had expected him to be defensive, perhaps even flustered. Instead, he was poised, unshaken, and utterly in control. She adjusted her posture, leaned in slightly, and attempted to redirect. "I think what people are really asking," she said carefully, "is whether these diversity-focused initiatives are creating an uneven playing field. Would you say that companies today are prioritizing representation over pure ability?" It was a question designed to reinforce the very bias she was trying to disguise as fair inquiry. A question meant to frame inclusion as a handout rather than a long-overdue correction. Nathaniel exhaled, slow and steady, the way a man does when he's been through this before. His hands rested loosely on the armrests of his chair, his body language relaxed yet powerful. "That's an interesting premise," he said, tilting his head as if studying the weight of her words. "Because it assumes that for generations, the playing field was fair. It assumes that opportunity was always given to the most qualified, the most talented, the most deserving. And yet, for decades, centuries even, executive boards, leadership teams, entire industries were dominated by one demographic. Not because others lacked ability, but because they were never even allowed to compete." His words settled over the room like a quiet storm. The host opened her mouth, but for the first time there was hesitation. Nathaniel leaned forward, his voice unwavering. "So let's ask the real question. Why is it that only now, when the doors are finally opening for more people, we suddenly feel the need to question merit?" Silence. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were thinking. The tension in the room was thick, pressing against the walls like an invisible force. The host, so accustomed to controlling the narrative, found herself in unfamiliar territory. Nathaniel Kane wasn't just answering questions. He was dismantling them, exposing the deeply embedded bias that had gone unchallenged for so long. She cleared her throat, glancing down at her cue cards before returning her gaze to him. She needed to regain her footing. "Surely you can understand why some people might feel that certain opportunities are being handed out unfairly," she said, her tone carefully measured. "Aren't we in danger of lowering standards just to meet diversity quotas?" Nathaniel smiled, not in amusement, but in recognition. This wasn't the first time he had heard this argument, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. He leaned forward, resting his hands lightly together. His voice was steady, patient, yet firm. "Lowering standards?" he echoed. "Tell me, when was the last time someone asked a white CEO if the bar had been lowered for them? When was the last time we questioned whether generational wealth, connections, or an old boy network played a role in their success?" The audience was utterly still. "For years, the system operated without scrutiny," Nathaniel continued. "We never questioned why boardrooms were filled with the same kind of people, why leadership positions were passed down like family heirlooms. But now, when opportunity is finally being extended beyond the usual circles, suddenly, we're concerned about fairness." The host shifted in her seat, but Nathaniel wasn't done. "If diversity initiatives were truly tilting the playing field unfairly, you wouldn't see what we see today. The Fortune 500 wouldn't have just a handful of black CEOs. If standards were being lowered, we'd be everywhere. But we're not. We're still fighting for every inch. So maybe the real question isn't whether standards have been lowered, but why they were never raised in the first place." A single clap echoed through the studio, then another. The tide was turning, and the host knew it. The tension in the studio had shifted from controlled skepticism to something more uncertain, a quiet recognition that the conversation was no longer following the usual script. The host, known for her piercing interviews and carefully framed questions, was beginning to feel the weight of the moment. She had expected pushback, but not like this. Nathaniel Kane wasn't reacting with frustration or defensiveness. He was dissecting the very premise of her argument, turning her words back on themselves with a calm precision that left no room for misinterpretation. She adjusted her posture, attempting to regain control. "Nathaniel," she said, forcing a polite smile, "we can all agree that representation is important, but surely you must acknowledge that there's a growing concern about companies feeling pressured to meet diversity quotas at the expense of true meritocracy. Don't you think there's a risk that we're prioritizing optics over qualifications?" Nathaniel exhaled lightly, his expression unreadable. He had been waiting for this. He knew it was coming. He let a beat of silence stretch between them, allowing the weight of the question to settle over the room before speaking. "It's interesting," he began, his voice measured, "that this conversation only ever seems to happen when people like me succeed. When a black executive steps into a position of power, the first assumption is not that they worked twice as hard, overcame barriers unseen by most, or outperformed their peers. It's that they were given something, that the system bent to accommodate them. But when the same position is held by someone else, no one questions how they got there." He leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering. "For decades, companies have hired people based on connections, privilege, and familiarity. No one asked if they truly earned it. No one worried that the playing field wasn't level. But the moment that field starts to open up to those who've historically been excluded, suddenly, we're deeply concerned about fairness." A murmur rippled through the audience, a quiet acknowledgement of the undeniable truth in his words. The host pressed her lips together, her composure slipping just slightly. She had lost control of the narrative. Nathaniel had taken the conversation beyond her intended talking points, exposing something deeper, something far more uncomfortable, and the audience knew it. The weight of the conversation had shifted. The studio, once filled with an air of controlled spectacle, now carried a tension that could be felt through the screen. The host, known for her ability to maintain the upper hand in interviews, was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that she was no longer in control. Nathaniel Kane had not just countered her question. He had dismantled the very premise behind it, exposing the flaws in the narrative that had been carefully constructed over decades. She took a slow breath, adjusting her posture as if bracing for a final attempt to steer the conversation back into familiar territory. "Nathaniel," she said with forced ease, "surely you must acknowledge that there are instances where companies, in their efforts to appear diverse, may prioritize image over actual ability. Isn't it fair to ask whether diversity efforts sometimes come at the cost of hiring the most qualified candidates?" Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, considering her words, but there was no hesitation in his response. "The assumption in your question is that diversity and excellence are somehow opposing forces. That by hiring people from different backgrounds, companies are inherently lowering their standards. But let's be honest, who decided what the standard was in the first place?" His voice was calm, but the intensity behind it was unmistakable. For generations, people have been given positions not because they were the most qualified, but because they fit a familiar mold, because they had the right connections, because they looked the part. No one questioned whether they truly earned their place. But the moment someone who doesn't fit that mold succeeds, suddenly we're having conversations about meritocracy. The silence that followed was deafening. The host blinked, her rehearsed arguments unraveling in real time. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "If we really care about qualifications, then let's raise the bar for everyone, not just for those who were never given a fair shot in the first place." The audience, now fully engaged in the moment, reacted, not with polite applause, but with the unmistakable energy of a shift taking place. And for the first time, the host seemed to realize that this was no longer her interview, it was his. The tension in the room was palpable, but Nathaniel Kane remained unshaken. He had been in this position before, facing skepticism, confronting the same tired narratives, being forced to justify his presence in spaces where people like him had historically been excluded. The difference now was that the audience, both in the studio and watching from their homes, was seeing the dynamic shift in real time. The host, who had built a career on putting powerful guests on the defensive, was now the one scrambling to regain control of the conversation. She attempted a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Nathaniel, no one is denying that you've worked hard to get where you are," she began, her tone softer now, more calculated. "But don't you think it's important to acknowledge that many people feel left behind in this changing landscape? That maybe, just maybe, the push for diversity is making some qualified individuals feel overlooked?" Nathaniel exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if giving her one last chance to realize the flaw in her reasoning before he dismantled it completely. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. He simply leaned forward, looking her directly in the eye. "Let me ask you something," he said smoothly. "When the playing field was uneven for decades, when hiring decisions were made in country clubs instead of boardrooms, when entire industries were built on exclusion, did anyone stop to ask if qualified people were being left behind then? Or is this concern only surfacing now that the doors have been opened just a little wider?" The host's expression flickered, her polished composure showing the smallest crack. Nathaniel didn't give her time to recover. "The truth is, for a long time, people were given opportunities not because they were the most qualified, but because they were the most familiar. Now that others are finally being given a fair shot, the conversation suddenly shifts to meritocracy. Funny how that works." A low murmur rippled through the audience, the weight of his words undeniable. The host opened her mouth to respond, but for the first time in the interview, she hesitated. Nathaniel had exposed something deeper than she was prepared to confront, and in that moment, it became clear. This wasn't just an interview. It was a reckoning. Nathaniel Kane knew exactly what was happening. The host, grasping for control, was trying to reframe the conversation, to shift the weight of responsibility back onto him, to make him justify his own success in a way that white CEOs never had to. But he wasn't going to let her dictate the terms. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black professional who had been forced to prove their worth twice over. Every leader who had been questioned simply for existing in spaces where they were never expected to thrive. She straightened her stack of cue cards, her lips pressing into a thin line before she spoke. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice carefully controlled, I think we can all agree that hard work and determination are important. But wouldn't you also agree that sometimes, in an effort to increase diversity, companies might be pressured to prioritize certain hires over more traditionally qualified candidates? Isn't there a risk that these efforts could lower the bar? There it was, the question she had been circling around all along, finally spoken out loud. Nathaniel didn't blink. He didn't sigh, didn't roll his eyes or shake his head, though every part of him wanted to. Instead, he gave her the same measured look he had perfected in boardrooms where investors doubted him before he even opened his mouth. Lower the bar? His voice was calm, but the edge was unmistakable. Let's talk about that, because I've spent my entire career proving myself in rooms where I was the only one who looked like me. I've built a company from the ground up without the luxury of generational wealth or insider connections. I've had to be twice as good just to be seen as competent. And now, when people like me finally break through, you want to have a conversation about standards? The audience was dead silent. The host's carefully curated expression faltered, if only for a second. Nathaniel leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. Let's be real. The bar was never high to begin with. It was just never open to everyone. Nathaniel Kane had spent years walking into rooms where the weight of expectation pressed down on him before he even spoke. He had learned, through experience, that power wasn't just about who held the highest title. It was about who controlled the conversation. And right now, sitting across from a host who was grasping at control, he knew that the real battle wasn't in the words being exchanged, but in what they revealed. The host adjusted her posture, her tone shifting into something softer but no less calculated. "Nathaniel," she said, as if she were about to guide him to some great revelation, "I think the real concern people have is that when companies focus too much on diversity initiatives, it can sometimes overshadow the importance of pure merit. We've seen cases where businesses make hiring decisions to meet certain quotas rather than simply choosing the best person for the job. Doesn't that worry you?" Nathaniel smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that signaled agreement. It was the smile of a man who had heard this argument 1,000 times before and had grown weary of its dishonesty. He took a slow breath before responding, making sure each word carried the weight of truth. "You say you're concerned about merit," he said evenly, "but let's talk about what that really means. Because for decades, for centuries, this country has operated under a system where the best person for the job was rarely the one who actually got it. People were hired and promoted based on who they knew, where they went to school, what families they came from, not just their talent." He leaned forward slightly, his voice never rising, but commanding attention all the same. Where was all this concern about merit when it was only one group of people getting those opportunities? Where was the outrage when companies promoted people who looked the same, thought the same, and came from the same privileged backgrounds? The only time this conversation seems to matter is when someone like me succeeds. The host opened her mouth, but Nathaniel wasn't finished. "The truth is, you don't want to talk about merit. You want to question whether I belong here. And that," he said, holding her gaze, "is the real conversation you're afraid to have." Nathaniel Kane had always understood the unspoken rules of success. He knew that for people like him, the bar was always set higher, the scrutiny always harsher, and the victories always questioned. But what he had never accepted was the idea that he had to justify his place at the table to people who had never been asked to do the same. And as he sat across from a host who was now scrambling to regain her footing, he realized that this conversation was about far more than just him. It was about an entire system that had been designed to keep people like him on the outside looking in. The host shifted in her seat, forcing a polite smile. "Nathaniel, I don't think anyone is questioning your success. But don't you think there's a conversation to be had about how businesses today might feel pressured to make decisions based on optics rather than qualifications? That's not to say you aren't qualified, of course, but—" Nathaniel cut in smoothly, his voice steady and unwavering. "But that's exactly what you're saying. And that's exactly why this conversation is so dangerous. Because when people like me achieve something, the first instinct isn't to acknowledge the work, the sacrifice, or the talent. It's to search for a reason why it might not be legitimate. It's to suggest, even subtly, that maybe we got here because of some external push rather than our own ability. He leaned back, letting the silence settle for a moment before continuing. Tell me, when a white executive takes over a Fortune 500 company, do you ask if they were given an unearned advantage? Do you wonder if their last name, their connections, their background played a role? Or is it just assumed that they worked hard and deserved it? The audience was silent now, watching as the weight of his words sank in. Nathaniel didn't need to raise his voice. He had already won. The only time we have this conversation, he said, is when success looks different than what we're used to. And that, he concluded, is what really needs to change. Nathaniel Kane knew that moments like this weren't just about one conversation. They were about something bigger, something that had shaped careers, industries, and entire narratives for generations. Sitting across from a host who had built her career on asking the tough questions, he recognized the game she was playing. But what she didn't realize was that he had already mastered it long before stepping onto this stage. The difference was, he wasn't here to play by her rules. He was here to change them. She tried to recover, shifting in her chair, her voice measured but strained. Nathaniel, don't you think it's fair for people to ask these questions? To wonder if programs designed to promote diversity sometimes lower the bar in ways that affect businesses? Nathaniel exhaled quietly, a slow and deliberate breath, as if he had heard this question 1,000 times before. And in truth, he had. Fair, he repeated, tilting his head slightly. That's an interesting choice of words, because fairness would mean we ask these same questions across the board. But we don't. We only ask them when someone like me is in this chair. He let the silence stretch, controlled and deliberate, before continuing. Tell me something. When was the last time a white CEO sat in this chair and was asked if they truly earned their position? When was the last time you questioned whether they benefited from a system designed to keep them at the top? Because if we're really talking about fairness, then let's talk about the countless executives who got where they are, not because they were the best, but because they were given the benefit of the doubt. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the weight of his words. He wasn't just answering her question. He was exposing the very foundation of it. The real conversation, he said, his voice unwavering, is not about whether people like me deserve to be here. It's about why, after all this time, some people still feel the need to ask. The moment Nathaniel Kane walked off that set, the conversation didn't end. It had only just begun. What transpired in that interview was more than just a verbal exchange. It was a lesson in resilience, confidence, and the power of truth in the face of subtle discrimination. He didn't just respond to a question. He dismantled an entire narrative that had been used for generations to cast doubt on the legitimacy of black success. And in doing so, he reminded millions of people watching that true power lies not in proving oneself to those who refuse to see, but in standing firm in the truth. The lesson here is not just about Nathaniel's individual success. It's about the deeply ingrained biases that still shape the way we see leadership, merit, and achievement. How often do we question the qualifications of those who have historically held power? Rarely, if ever. Yet when someone like Nathaniel reaches the top, the conversation suddenly shifts, not to his accomplishments, but to whether he truly belongs there. This is not just an oversight. It is a reflection of a system that has, for too long, denied certain people a seat at the table. But Nathaniel's response wasn't about anger. It wasn't about seeking validation. It was about changing the narrative. It was about taking control of the conversation and refusing to let others define his worth. And that is the takeaway for all of us. We do not need to apologize for our presence in spaces where we have earned the right to be. We do not need to explain away our success to those who refuse to accept it. Instead, we need to do exactly what Nathaniel did. Stand firm, speak truth, and let the world see us for who we are. If this story inspired you, if it made you think, if it challenged the way you view success and bias, then join us in continuing this conversation. Subscribe to Civil Rights Fight and be a part of a movement that refuses to let history repeat itself. Because this is more than just one interview. This is a fight for respect, for equality, and for the right to succeed without question.